The FBI file was labeled Operation Guardian, subject, James Paul McCartney, classification, imminent threat to life. Hidden in the evidence collected from Mark David Chapman's apartment after John Lennon's assassination was something that terrified law enforcement. A detailed hit list containing the names of 4 Beatles members, with John Lennon crossed out and Paul McCartney circled in red ink. When the FBI files were declassified in 2022, they revealed the most chilling secret in music history. Paul McCartney had been the next target, and for 2 years after John's death, he lived under federal protection without ever knowing his life was in danger. What Chapman had written next to Paul's name was so disturbing that the FBI immediately classified the entire investigation. But the threat wasn't just from Chapman. The documents revealed a network of obsessed fans who saw killing Beatles members as a path to immortality. For 730 days, Paul McCartney walked through his daily life while federal agents shadowed his every move, protecting him from a danger he couldn't even imagine. If you love discovering the untold stories behind music history's darkest secrets, you need to hear this. Because sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't what happened. It's what almost happened, and the protection we never knew we needed. New York Police Department, December 9th, 1980, 3:47 a.m. Detective James Murphy had seen crime scenes before, but Mark David Chapman's apartment was unlike anything in his 20-year career. The man who had shot John Lennon just hours earlier had been living in a shrine to obsession, walls covered with Beatles photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes that revealed the depth of his psychological breakdown. But it was what Murphy found in Chapman's desk drawer that made his blood run cold. A spiral notebook titled The Plan, containing detailed information about all 4 Beatles members, their addresses, daily routines, and security arrangements. John Lennon's name was crossed out in black ink, with completed 12-880 written next to it. Paul McCartney's name was circled in red, with Next London written underneath. George Harrison and Ringo Starr's names followed, each with detailed surveillance notes about their movements and vulnerabilities. "Holy Christ," Murphy whispered, realizing they weren't just dealing with one murder. They were looking at the opening act of a planned massacre. FBI Headquarters, New York, December 10th, 1980, 7:30 a.m. Special Agent Sarah Collins had been called in to assess the Chapman evidence for federal implications. What she found in that notebook would launch the most intensive celebrity protection operation in FBI history. Chapman hadn't just planned to kill John Lennon. He had spent over 2 years researching all 4 Beatles members, studying their habits, learning their schedules, and developing assassination scenarios for each one. Paul McCartney represents the ultimate target, Chapman had written. More famous than Lennon, more accessible, more trusting. Killing him would make me more famous than killing John. The world would remember my name forever. The notebook contained floor plans of Paul's London home, photographs of his children's school routes, and detailed timing charts of his daily activities. Chapman had somehow obtained information that should have been impossible for a private citizen to access. But most disturbing were Chapman's connections to other Beatles obsessives. The notebook contained names, addresses, and phone numbers of at least 12 other individuals who Chapman described as fellow soldiers in the war against false idols. Agent Collins immediately classified the investigation and contacted the British authorities. Paul McCartney was in immediate danger, and he didn't even know it. Scotland Yard, London, December 11th, 1980, 2 p.m. Detective Chief Inspector Michael Harrison received the FBI intelligence with growing alarm. Chapman's network wasn't theoretical. There were active threats against Paul McCartney operating on British soil. We've identified at least 4 individuals in the UK who were in regular contact with Chapman, Harrison wrote in his classified report. Phone records show Chapman called London numbers 17 times in the month before Lennon's murder, apparently coordinating activities with local accomplices. British intelligence had been monitoring one of Chapman's contacts, a 34-year-old man named David Walsh, who had been arrested twice for loitering outside Paul's home. Walsh's apartment, when searched, contained weapons, detailed maps of Paul's neighborhood, and copies of the same Beatles surveillance information found in Chapman's possession. Walsh appears to be Chapman's designated UK operative, Harrison concluded. He has the means, motive, and detailed planning necessary to carry out an attack on Paul McCartney. We must assume imminent threat. The Secret Protection, December 15, 1980. Without Paul's knowledge, the most sophisticated personal protection operation in British history was activated. A joint FBI Scotland Yard task force began monitoring Paul's every movement while maintaining complete invisibility. Agent Collins coordinated the American side of the operation from London, working with British authorities to create an invisible security bubble around Paul and his family. The subject must never know he's under protection, Collins wrote in her operational guidelines. Any awareness of the threat could compromise his psychological well-being and potentially make him a more vulnerable target. 24 agents worked in rotating shifts, disguised as pedestrians, delivery drivers, maintenance workers, and tourists. Paul's regular haunts, Abbey Road Studios, his favorite restaurants, his children's schools, all had permanent surveillance teams. Linda McCartney later revealed that during this period, she noticed an unusual number of friendly strangers who seemed to appear wherever they went. There was always someone nearby offering to help with directions, or to carry packages, or just making pleasant conversation. I thought London had become extraordinarily friendly. What Linda didn't know was that every helpful stranger was an armed federal agent. The intercepted communications January-March 1981 FBI wiretaps revealed that Chapman's network remained active even after his arrest. Phone intercepts captured multiple conversations between UK-based conspirators discussing completing the mission and honoring Chapman's vision. David Walsh, under surveillance in London, was recorded making several disturbing statements. John was just the beginning. Paul is the real prize. When I finish what Chapman started, they'll build statues of me. The Beatles corrupted our children with their drug music and Eastern religion. Someone has to stop them. Paul thinks he's safe in London, but I know where he lives, where he shops, where his children play. Agent Collins realized they weren't just protecting Paul from random violence. They were dealing with an organized conspiracy that viewed Beatles members as legitimate targets in some kind of cultural war. The Close Call Abbey Road Studios, March 23, 1981. Paul's closest brush with danger came during a routine recording session at Abbey Road. David Walsh had somehow learned about the session and positioned himself outside the studio with a concealed weapon. Surveillance footage later showed Walsh waiting near the studio entrance for over 3 hours, checking his watch repeatedly and becoming increasingly agitated as Paul's session ran longer than expected. Subject appeared to be timing an approach. Agent Peterson wrote in his report. When Paul finally emerged at 11:47 p.m. instead of the expected 9:30 p.m., subject seemed confused and ultimately abandoned whatever plan he had intended to execute. Walsh was arrested 2 blocks from the studio carrying a loaded revolver and detailed floor plans of Abbey Road's interior. When questioned, he claimed he was following instructions from America and expected to become as famous as Chapman. Paul never knew how close he had come to becoming the second Beatles member murdered within 4 months. The network unravels. April-September 1981. Over the next 6 months, FBI and British authorities systematically dismantled Chapman's conspiracy network. 12 arrests were made across the U.S. and U.K., including several individuals who had been actively planning attacks on Paul, George, and Ringo. The investigation revealed that Chapman hadn't acted alone in his obsession. He had spent years building a network of like-minded individuals who viewed the Beatles as symbols of cultural corruption that needed to be eliminated. Chapman saw himself as the leader of a movement, Agent Collins wrote in her final report. He believed that systematically murdering all 4 Beatles members would somehow restore cultural purity to American and British society. The network included former military personnel with weapons training, individuals with security clearances who could access private information, and obsessed fans who had been gradually radicalized by Chapman's ideology. The threat assessment, September 1982. After nearly 2 years of investigation, the FBI concluded that the immediate threat to Paul McCartney had been neutralized. Chapman's network was dismantled, his key associates were in custody, and no new threats had emerged. The subject can be transitioned to standard celebrity security protocols, Agent Collins recommended. However, given the precedent of the Lennon assassination, we recommend permanent monitoring for any emerging threats. Paul's protection detail was gradually reduced, then withdrawn entirely. He never knew he had been under federal protection, never knew about Chapman's hit list, never learned how close he had come to following John into an early grave. The Declassification 2022. When the FBI files were finally declassified 42 years later, the music world was stunned to learn how organized and extensive the threat to surviving Beatles members had been. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a criminologist who studied the declassified documents, described the case as the most comprehensive celebrity assassination conspiracy in modern history. Chapman wasn't just a lone gunman, Dr. Mitchell explained. He was the leader of a sophisticated network that viewed murdering Beatles members as a religious crusade. If they had succeeded in killing Paul McCartney, it's likely they would have continued until all 4 members were dead. The documents revealed that federal authorities had considered the threat so serious that they prepared contingency plans to relocate Paul and his family to a secure location if the danger escalated. Paul's response, 2022. When shown excerpts from the declassified files, Paul McCartney's reaction was a mixture of gratitude and horror. "I had no idea," Paul said in a private statement. "For 2 years after John died, I thought I was just living my normal life, making music, raising my children. To learn that federal agents were watching over us, that there were people actively planning to kill me, it's overwhelming." Paul was particularly disturbed to learn how close the March 1981 Abbey Road incident had come to tragedy. "I remember that session running late, and I was annoyed because I wanted to get home to Linda and the kids. Now I realize that delay might have saved my life. Sometimes the universe protects you in ways you never understand. The legacy. The Chapman conspiracy remains classified in many details, but what has been revealed shows how John Lennon's murder was intended to be just the beginning of a systematic campaign against one of the world's most beloved bands. Paul McCartney continued making music throughout the period when he was under federal protection, never knowing that armed agents were ensuring his safety. Some of his most optimistic songs from that era, Ebony and Ivory, Here Today, were written while he was literally surrounded by invisible guardians protecting him from threats he couldn't imagine. It makes me think about all the protection we receive that we're not aware of, Paul reflected. Not just from government agents, but from friends, from family, from strangers who choose kindness over hatred. John died because one person chose violence. I lived because dozens of people chose to protect life. The Chapman files remind us that fame can be both a gift and a curse, that creativity can inspire both love and deadly obsession. But they also remind us that for every person who chooses darkness, there are many more who choose to guard the light. Because sometimes the heroes aren't the ones on stage making music. They're the invisible protectors, making sure the music never stops.